At this point, stronger cold was approaching the seedling Arks city, and measures needed to be taken. This would determine what priorities the leader of this city would have in terms of research and gathering resources. Both would be essential for continued survival. At the start of day 11, the work shift to be more precise, another automaton was being constructed. Well, construction was about to be completed. As for the seedling Arks, all of the Arks would have at least one steam hub nearby. Which, considering the approaching cold, would be most useful. And with all construction dealt with, at least in the short term, the engineers were reallocated to either the cookhouse or the hothouse, as more food needed to be gathered and prepared. Preferably with a surplus. It was at this point that the generator could be raised in temperature. After that, better housing was the next priority. More heat is good, but better insulated housing, that was even better, and the stone ship was merely a landmark. The supply trailer in the distance, however, was more promising. At least in terms of finding something useful. As when there's something left behind like that, well, there's usually something worth salvaging. The engineers thanked their leader for allowing them to do their work and improve the lives of everyone that's living in that city, continuing their work. Something vital for restoring the plant life. It will be frozen in the storm. there was more coal being used on the... Oh yes, and there was a accident involving automatons. The leader wisely slowed them down to avoid that in future, although it would make them less efficient. And a prosthetic would be necessary. Thought I had this pile of scrap metal fixed. Well, at least now I can get back to what I was talking about. Oh yes. After the bunkhouses were researched, proper housing was the next to be dealt with. Proper housing that would be enough to keep those within it relatively comfortable. Yes, to make sure that the amount of coal being used didn't fill the storage, which would have needed expansion at some point. The leader of the seedling Ark city alternated between setting 1 and setting 2. Wood was gathered from one of these scout locations. A lone boulder looks more promising with the options for vital supplies. With setting 1 of the generator, more coal was being used. No, more coal was being gathered than used. The main reason why the steam coal mine wasn't researched by this point was, well, there was a lack of steam cores to make that an option. And it was at this point that he decided that it was a good idea to improve the housing for those living within the city with a specific purpose, and not one just for preserving the remains of humanity, regardless of where they come from. Steel and steam cores. They needed to go back to the seedling Arks city, along with the rest of the supplies. All would be needed for quite an overhaul of... Well, let us just say that there'd be at least one more automaton being constructed. Along with a reason for other improvements. Speaking of which, at this point, the leader of the seedling Arks city decided that it would be a good time to improve the housing. He was not patient enough to wait for the proper house to be researched. Additional comforts couldn't wait. And besides, it required less resources to improve existing housing than to create a fresh one. From practically nothing. Not unless you count the resources to make it from what was essentially an empty plot. The day when the cold would be greater was approaching. There was hope that preparations would be made by the time that it arrived. Just before the next main work shift, the lone boulder was just another point of navigation. A shelter was more promising.
Work time. Get back to work.
Preparations were almost complete. And it wouldn't be a moment too soon, considering there was a day of extreme cold, even by Frostland standards, although it wouldn't be the worst, as we already know. most of the housing had been upgraded to something better insulated by this point. And thankfully the steam hubs work even when on standby. Yes, that is a good term as any for describing that. Where on that setting they only generate heat when the timing setting was... oh yes, and the house can now be built. Well, by this point is good. As for what to research next... that needed more thoughts. There are a few options. And this was not easy. In the end, he chose to research the steam coal mine, considering that there was a shipment of steam cores and other resources. So it would not just be plenty of... oh yes, and one of the automatons was stuck in one of the coal mines, so that one was taken out of commission and another automaton was reassigned. Yes. When it comes to a sacrifice between an automaton being out of commission temporarily or the coal mine being taken out of commission temporarily, the automaton is the least worst of the two options. Well, I'd certainly think so in his position. Which was why it was best to reallocate one of the automatons working in gathering wood to gathering coal. Because having enough wood was nice, but it would do little good to anyone. If the coal ran out, because it wouldn't just be a case of people freezing to death, it would also mean the automatons would run out of fuel. As for the shelter, that had some food, and more importantly, steam cores. They needed to be delivered quickly.
End of shift. Go rest all who can.
With the steam coal mine researched, it was only a matter of time before that could use some improvements. Although any other research that could be done, well, that required more steel. Which would be not a problem, considering what was approaching. Well, first one would arrive, then the other. The decision was proving difficult. Especially with the lack of resources. More coal was arriving. And the housing was about to become as good as it could be at this point. Rejoice! The seedling Arks city at the... There was enough to improve the existing coal gathering facilities. Well, one of them anyway. And it was also a good time to make another automaton. Although the question of where to send it, that would be a matter for another time. As for where to send the scouts... somewhere to the north might be a good idea, which was what he was probably thinking at the time. As for what to research next, and there was no shortage of resources this time. It was... let's see, what did he have researched by this point? Yes, let's see, right. Oh yes! An improvement to the hothouse in order to have more food coming in. Yes, if anything was going to be a constant, it would be a need for having a surplus before the storm hits. Largely because nothing would be able to grow under those conditions. It was a long wait, all throughout the night, but in the end, just before the next work shift, more resources arrived. There was more steel and coal than they knew what to do with. And soon there would be much more coal. As for the second Scouts party, they were sent south. In completely the exact opposite area of where they were. It was at this point that it was decided that would be a good time to expand. The storage of certain resources. Well, coal and food would certainly be a good thing to have. And at this point,
Brace yourselves.
the housing was fully improved, and not a moment too soon, because the coals had greatly decreased. And thankfully, there was more coal coming in than going out, due to improved mining capabilities. Which was why it was best to hold off on improving the second one. The people of the seedling Arks city had not known what coals was, at least until day 13. Although other things were approaching besides coals. Something that they would eventually find out.